The day Maggie Turner rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, the summer of 1882, her wagon wheel cracked clean in half and her pride along with it. And that was how she met the only man in the territory who never once smiled. She had been traveling alone for 11 days from Santa Fe, which was already enough to earn her the wide-eyed stares of the townspeople who gathered on the main street to watch her wagon limp to a stop in the middle of the road. A woman traveling alone in those parts was either running from something or running toward it, and in Maggie Turner's case, it was decidedly the latter. She had a letter in her coat pocket, folded and refolded until the creases had gone soft, offering her the position of schoolteacher at the newly established Dusty Creek schoolhouse. It was signed by the mayor himself, a man named Gerald Potts, and it promised room, board, and a modest salary that was more than enough to start fresh. Starting fresh was exactly what Maggie intended to do. She was 24 years old, sharp-eyed. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned firmly beneath a sun-bleached bonnet, and she had learned to take care of herself in ways most women of her time were never taught. Her father, a schoolteacher himself in Santa Fe, had raised her after her mother died of fever when Maggie was barely 7, and he had made certain she could read, argue, cipher, and hold her own in any conversation that came her way. He had passed on 2 years before, leaving her the small house and enough money to keep herself for a year, but Maggie had no intention of sitting still and watching the money shrink away. So when Gerald Potts had placed a notice in the Santa Fe Gazette asking for an educated woman to teach the children of Dusty Creek, Maggie had written back before the ink on the advertisement was even dry. Now she stood beside her ruined wagon in the middle of the main street of Dusty Creek, her trunk sitting in the wagon bed, and about 30 people staring at her like she had dropped from the sky. "You need help with that," a woman called from the porch of the general store. "I would appreciate it very much," Maggie called back, keeping her voice even and polite, the same voice she had practiced for years because her father had told her that a steady voice earned more respect than a loud one. That was when she first saw Clayton Granger. He came from the direction of the livery stable, walking with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who had never once needed to hurry for anything in his life. He was tall, broad through the shoulder, and wearing the dust of long days on every inch of his clothing. His hat was dark brown and worn at the brim, his boots were cracked leather that had been resoled at least twice, and his face was the kind of face that made people look twice, not because it was handsome in any obvious way, though it was, but because there was something in it that made you feel like you were trying to read a book that had been left out in the rain. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a shifting kind of gray-green that caught the light differently depending on where he stood. He looked at the broken wheel, looked at Maggie, and looked at the wheel again. Then, without a single word, he walked to the back of her wagon, assessed the damage with hands that moved quickly and surely, and said, in a voice that was low and careful, "I can fix this. It will take about an hour." "Thank you," Maggie said, watching him. "I am Maggie Turner. I am the new schoolteacher." "I know," he said, and that was all he said. She waited for more. A name, perhaps, a welcome, even a nod toward the social niceties that people generally offered strangers, but he simply turned back to the wheel and began the work of dismantling it, moving with the quiet precision of someone who had spent a great deal of his life making broken things work again. "And you are?" she asked, because she was not the kind of woman who let silence win. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "Clayton Granger. Do you live here in Dusty Creek, Mr. Granger?" "I work here." "That is not quite the same thing." He was quiet for a moment, hands still working. "No," he agreed. "I suppose it is not." The woman from the general store, who introduced herself as Ruth Henley, the storekeeper's wife, came over and took Maggie's arm kindly and steered her toward the porch. "Come on out of the sun, honey, and let Clayton work. He is the best hand with anything mechanical in the whole territory. He has a gift for fixing things." She said it the way people said things about a person they admired but also found difficult, with warmth and a careful distance in the same breath. "He does not say much," Maggie observed, settling into a chair Ruth offered her. Ruth handed her a tin cup of water and laughed a short, warm laugh. "He does not say anything if he can help it. Been that way since he came to Dusty Creek 3 years ago. Works at the ranch out east the cowhound spread, keeps to himself. Does not make trouble, does not go looking for company. Comes into town for supplies and church on Sunday, and that is about the extent of his social life." She paused and lowered her voice. "Good man, though. Helped old Pete Simmons get his barn roof back on after the storm last spring, would not take a cent for it. Just did it." Maggie looked back toward where Clayton was working, his movements efficient and unhurried, and she thought that a man who helped without being asked and then refused payment was either very good or very complicated, and in her experience those two things were usually the same. Mayor Gerald Potts arrived shortly after, a round-faced, cheerful man who pumped Maggie's hand vigorously and apologized for not having sent someone to meet her on the road, and then proceeded to show her to the small house beside the schoolhouse that had been set aside for her use. It was modest, 2 rooms, a fireplace, and a narrow back porch that looked out over the flat land stretching east toward the mountains, but it was clean and it was hers, and Maggie stood in the center of it and breathed deeply and felt something that might have been the first edge of peace she had touched in a long while. Clayton Granger had her wagon fixed and her trunk delivered to the house by the time the sun had moved a hand's width across the sky. He left the trunk on her porch without knocking, and she only knew he had come because she heard the sound of boots on the wooden steps and looked out to find him already walking away. "Mr. Granger," she called. He stopped and turned. "Thank you, truly. How much do I owe you?" "Nothing," he said. "I insist on paying you." "Then you will be insisting at nothing," he said, and turned back around and walked away down the road, and she stood in her doorway watching him go and felt the strangest sensation, like a puzzle had just been placed in her hands that she had not asked for but now could not put down. The school year began 3 days later, and Maggie threw herself into it with the kind of energy that tends to either alarm people or impress them, and in Dusty Creek it impressed them. She had 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, and within the first week she had learned all their names, their family situations, their particular strengths and weaknesses, and had already begun writing letters to Santa Fe asking for more books. She held her school from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and then she spent her evenings planning the next day's lessons and reading everything she could find about the territory. She saw Clayton Granger again on Sunday, just as Ruth had predicted, at the small whitewashed church on the north end of Main Street. He sat in the back row, hat in his lap, his profile sharp and still as cut stone. He did not sing the hymns, but he followed the words in the small book with his eyes, and Maggie, seated 4 rows ahead, turned once to look at the congregation and caught him looking at her. He looked away at once, but she had seen it, and she filed it away without quite knowing why. After the service, people gathered in the churchyard in the way of small towns everywhere, talking and trading news and letting the children run briefly wild before they had to go home. Maggie moved through the small crowd, learning faces and names, and eventually found herself near the water trough where Clayton was standing alone, turning his hat slowly in his hands the way people do when they are uncomfortable but too stubborn to leave. "Good morning, Mr. Granger," she said pleasantly. "Morning," he said. She waited. He said nothing more. Around them, children shrieked and a dog barked and 2 old men argued amiably about the price of feed corn. "Did you enjoy the sermon?" she tried. He considered this with the same seriousness he might have given a legal question. "The Reverend uses too many words to say simple things," he said finally. Maggie blinked and then she laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that she had not expected, and it felt good in her chest. "That is the most precise criticism of a sermon I have ever heard." Something shifted very slightly in his expression. Not a smile, but a softening around the eyes that was its own kind of communication. I did not mean any offense to the Reverend. Of course not. You were being honest. She tilted her head, studying him. Do you always say what you mean, Mr. Granger? I try to. That is rarer than it ought to be. He looked at her then directly and steadily, the way he had looked at the broken wheel, like he was trying to figure out what was wrong and how to fix it, and she found that she did not mind being looked at that way. You are not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He seemed to think about whether to answer and then said, someone quieter. I am quiet when there is nothing worth saying, Maggie told him. It turns out there usually is. He nodded once slowly, and then replaced his hat on his head. Good day, Miss Turner, he said, and walked to where a dark horse was tied at the rail, and rode out of town in the direction of the Calhoun Ranch without looking back. She watched him go again. She was beginning to suspect that watching Clayton Granger walk away was going to become a habit she could not explain to anyone, including herself. The weeks passed with the good rhythm of a place that had enough work to keep everyone busy and enough small pleasures to keep everyone sane. Maggie's school became the center of her life, and she was good at her work in the deep and serious way that meant she was not just teaching children their letters and numbers, but teaching them how to think, how to question, how to hold a thought long enough to turn it over and look at it from the other side. Parents stopped her on the street to say that their children were talking differently, asking more questions, reading by candlelight until they were told firmly to go to sleep. Mayor Potts came by the school one Friday afternoon, ostensibly to check on the supply order, but really, Maggie suspected, because he had heard good things and wanted to see for himself. He watched her through the open door for a few minutes and then shook her hand very solemnly and said she was the best thing to happen to Dusty Creek in some time, and she thanked him and meant it. She began, in the natural way of things, to become part of the town. Ruth Henley became a friend, a warm and steady woman who always had coffee on and a sharp observation ready. There was also a woman named Clara Marsh, the blacksmith's wife, who organized a small reading group that met on Thursday evenings, and a doctor named Emmett Hale, who was also the closest thing Dusty Creek had to a town philosopher, given to long reflections on the human condition that were either very wise or very tiresome depending on the day. And there was Clayton Granger, who she kept running into in the way that you run into people in small towns, unavoidably and with increasing frequency, until you realize that the whole town is essentially just a setting designed to put two particular people in the same room. She ran into him at the general store in mid-September when she was buying chalk and he was buying rope. He was ahead of her in line, and when he turned and saw her, he stepped back without a word to let her go first. She shook her head and gestured for him to go ahead, and he looked at her with that still, assessing gaze and said, "You were here first." "I did not see you when I came in," she said. "You were here first." "I let myself be seen when I choose to be," he said, and there was no arrogance in it, only plainness, and she did not know whether to be amused or unnerved, so she settled on both. She let him go first. He bought his rope, tucked the coil under his arm, and paused at the door. "How is the school coming?" he asked, and it was the most unprompted thing he had ever said to her. "Very well," she said, surprised enough to add, "Would you like to come see it sometime?" He looked at her for a long moment. "I do not have children." "You do not need children to be interested in the education of them," she said. "The whole town benefits." He was quiet again, and then, "maybe," which from Clayton Granger she was beginning to understand, was about as close to a yes as you were likely to get. He came the following Tuesday. She was in the middle of a geography lesson when she looked up and found him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, watching. The children noticed him, and there was the usual flurry of distraction, but Maggie kept her voice level and finished her point about the Rio Grande before she acknowledged him. "Class," she said, "we have a visitor. This is Mr. Clayton Granger, who is a rancher in our community." She used the word community deliberately. "Mr. Granger, would you like to sit for a moment while we finish?" He sat in the one empty chair at the back of the room, which happened to be a child's chair, and was therefore comically small for a man of his size. but he sat in it without complaint or apparent embarrassment, elbows on his knees, and listened to the rest of the lesson with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything. When the children were dismissed for the day, they streamed past him with their usual noise, and a small boy named Tommy Hendricks stopped and said, very seriously, "Are you going to be our teacher too?" And Clayton said just as seriously, "No, I was just learning something myself." And Tommy Hendricks considered this gravely and nodded and went on his way. When the room was empty, Maggie began erasing the board. She could feel Clayton still sitting there. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You were right," he said. "It matters," she turned. "What does?" "What you are doing here." He gestured at the room, the maps on the wall, the small bookshelf she had organized carefully by subject. "Children out here do not always get this." "No," she agreed. "They do not, and that is wrong." He nodded slowly. "My mother taught me to read," he said, and it was said in the tone of someone offering something they do not often offer. "We did not have a school. She used whatever she could find. Labels on cans, old newspapers, a Bible." Maggie set down her eraser and looked at him. This was more than she had heard him say at one time, and she had the instinct to be very still, the way you are still when a bird lands near you and you do not want to startle it. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," she said. "She was," he said, and his voice did not change in any obvious way, but there was weight in the past tense that told her everything she needed to know. "I am sorry," she said quietly. He stood then, replacing his hat with a single practiced motion. "Thank you for letting me sit in." He moved toward the door and then stopped, and she thought he was going to say something more, but instead he just stood there for a moment with his back to her, and then he turned and said, "Good evening, Miss Turner," and left. She stood in the quiet schoolroom for a long time after he was gone, thinking about mothers who taught their children to read from can labels, and men who carried that like a stone in their chest and never put it down. October came in warm and golden, the way October does in New Mexico territory, the light going amber and slanted, the evenings cooling fast after the long, soft days. The town began preparing for a harvest social that Ruth Henley had organized, which was the main social event of the fall, and which everyone in town was expected to attend and enjoy whether they liked dancing or not. Maggie helped decorate the town hall with dried corn and bunting, and she got roped into baking 2 pies which she accomplished competently if not brilliantly, her pastry being somewhat tougher than ideal, a fact she freely admitted. She thought about whether Clayton would come to the social. She thought about it more than she strictly needed to, which was information she chose to ignore for the time being. He came. He arrived at the edge of things, as seemed to be his habit, standing near the wall where the light from the lanterns did not quite reach, nursing a cup of something and watching the dancing with an expression that was not quite detachment but was close to it. Maggie, who had danced twice already with the mayor and once with Dr. Hale and was now taking a rest from it, made her way over. "You look like a man deciding whether to ford a river," she said. He glanced at her. "What?" "The dancing." "You look like you are calculating the current." His jaw moved slightly, not a smile but something adjacent to one. "I do not dance," he said. "That is a shame." "Is it?" "Dancing is one of the few things people of every stripe can do together without arguing about politics or land rights," she said. "It is rather democratic." He looked at the dancers. "I have 2 left feet." "That I do not believe," she said. "You move like someone who knows where his feet are at all times." He looked at her then, and there was something new in his expression, something careful and curious at once. "You notice things," he said. "I was raised by a teacher," she told him. "I was trained to notice things. It is either a gift or an affliction, depending on who you ask." "What do you notice about me?" He asked, and the question was asked with such studied neutrality that she understood it cost him something to ask it. She thought about being careful. She decided not to be. "I notice that you are not as closed off as you appear. I notice that you came to see my school, which was not nothing. I notice that you never smile, not once in all the weeks I have seen you, and I have been watching because it is a puzzle." His expression changed so slightly it might have been the lantern light shifting. Not a very interesting puzzle, he said. I think quite the opposite, she said. And then the fiddle player struck up a new reel and someone grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the dancing before she could say anything else. And when she looked back from the middle of the floor, Clayton was still standing in his same spot, watching her with those creekwater eyes, and he had not moved at all. She danced until her feet ached and her face hurt from laughing, and when she finally looked for him again, he was gone. November brought the first cold, the thin blue kind that comes off the mountains before the real winter sets in, and it brought other things too. A man named Wallace Crick, who owned a spread of land 3 miles south of the Calhoun Ranch, had been causing trouble with the small Mexican families who had been farming along the creek bed for 2 generations. Crick claimed the water rights that fed their irrigation ditches and had begun the slow, grinding legal and extra-legal process of squeezing them out. It was an old story in the territory, told in a dozen different ways, and it was ugly every time. Maggie knew about it because 2 of her students were from those families, a girl named Lucia Reyes and a boy named Tomás Reyes, who were cousins, and they had begun coming to school with the particular tight-faced quiet of children who had heard too many difficult adult conversations the night before. She talked to Ruth about it, and Ruth pressed her lips together and said, "It is a bad business, Maggie, and the law is not always on the right side of it." She talked to Dr. Hale about it, and he shook his head and said, "Crick has money and he has lawyers and he knows how to use both." She tried to talk to Mayor Potts about it, and he was sympathetic in the way of men who do not want to make enemies, full of sighs and gentle hand-wringing but no action. And then one afternoon she was walking home from school, and she came across Clayton Granger sitting outside the feed store on an upturned crate, sharpening a knife with slow, patient strokes, and she sat down on the step beside him without invitation and said, "Do you know about the Reyes families and Wallace Crick?" He did not stop his work. "Yes. What is being done about it? Not enough. That is not an answer." He set down the whetstone and looked at her. "Has papers that say the water rights were reassigned to him after a sale that the Reyes families did not know about or agree to. His lawyer filed them in the county seat in September. By the time anyone here found out, it was already moving through the system." "That is theft," she said flatly. "Yes," he said, "but it is the kind of theft that wears a suit." She was quiet for a moment, watching the street. "There has to be something that can be done. If those families lose their water, they lose their crops. If they lose their crops, they lose everything. Lucia and Tomás are the brightest students I have. They deserve a future that does not get stolen out from under them." He was watching her and she did not look at him because she was thinking hard, and after a moment she heard him say very quietly, "I have been writing letters." She turned. "What?" "To the Territorial Land Office, and to a lawyer I know in Albuquerque who deals with land fraud cases." He said it evenly without any suggestion that it was remarkable. "I have been doing it since October." She looked at him for a long time. "Why have you not told anyone?" "Because it might not work," he said. "And I do not like raising hopes I cannot keep." She thought about that. She thought about a man who quietly, without any announcement, took on the cause of people who had no power and worked on it alone and never said a word. "Clayton," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both noticed it. "That is a decent thing you are doing." He looked away down the street. "It is the right thing," he said, as though the distinction mattered, and to him it clearly did. She sat beside him a little longer in the cold afternoon air, and they did not say very much more, and it was the most comfortable silence she had shared with anyone in a long time. Through November and into December, they fell into an unplanned and unspoken routine. On Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, he would find reasons to be in the part of town near the school, and she would find reasons to take a slightly longer route home, and they would walk together for a stretch of the main street, talking or not talking in equal measure, and she began to understand that his silences were not empty, but were the kind that happen when a person is really listening. He told her things, slowly, and in the careful way of someone who had spent a long time keeping everything inside. His mother had died when he was 17, of a sickness that came on fast and did not leave. His father had been a man of violent moods and limited warmth who had disappeared when Clayton was 12, gone one morning and never come back. And Clayton had spent years not knowing which outcome he preferred, the knowing or the not knowing. He had worked cattle since he was old enough to ride, moving from spread to spread through Texas and into New Mexico, learning the land and the work and the people, and landing finally at the Calhoun Ranch 3 years ago when Tom Calhoun had offered him the foreman's position, and it had seemed as good a reason as any to stop moving. "Did you never want a place of your own?" she asked one afternoon, their breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I thought about it," he said. "There is a parcel of land about 8 miles northeast of here on the far side of Coyote Ridge, good grazing, a decent stream. I have been thinking about it for a year." "What stops you?" He was quiet for a moment. "It seemed like something you do when you have a reason." She did not push on that. She filed it away instead in the growing collection of things she understood about him that she could not fully explain to anyone else. She told him things, too, in equal trade. About her father, who had been the best man she knew and who she missed every single day. About the house in Santa Fe that she had sold, because keeping it felt like trying to hold sand. About the young man she had been engaged to 3 years ago, a merchant's son named Philip Alderton, who had been perfectly pleasant and perfectly wrong for her in every way she could not have articulated at the time but understood very clearly now. She had ended it 6 months before the wedding, giving back the ring and causing a scandal that was still whispered about in certain Santa Fe circles. "Was it hard?" Clayton asked. "Ending it." "It was hard and right at the same time," she said. "Which is the worst kind of hard?" He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "I know something about that." She wanted to ask what he meant, but something in his tone closed the subject gently, and she respected the boundary. What she did not tell him, because she was not yet sure what to do with it herself, was that she had begun to think about him at odd moments during the day, in the middle of a lesson, or while making her tea in the evenings, thinking about what he had said or what he had not said, and feeling an anticipation for Tuesday and Thursday that was entirely disproportionate to two people who were only, technically, barely even friends. Christmas came to Dusty Creek with a cold snap and a modest celebration, and the town did its best with what it had, which was considerable good feeling if not considerable material wealth. Maggie organized the children to perform 3 songs at the church Christmas Eve service, which they did adequately and with tremendous enthusiasm, and the whole congregation applauded with the generous warmth of people who love children's performances for what they are rather than what they technically accomplish. She saw Clayton at the service, again at the back, and this time when the congregation turned to wish their neighbors well, he turned too and found her across the rows and gave her a nod that was small and precise and warmer than it had any right to be for such a small gesture. On Christmas morning, she found a package on her doorstep, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a book, a recent printing of Mary Shelley's collected essays, and tucked inside the front cover was a small card that said only, in a careful, deliberate hand, "For someone who notices things. C.G." She pressed the card between her palms and stood in her cold doorway for a long moment, and felt something in her chest rearrange itself quietly and permanently. She spent Christmas Day with Ruth and her husband Ben, and it was a good day, warm and full of the comfortable noise of the Henley children and too much food, and the particular pleasure of being welcomed into a family's table when you do not have your own. But she found herself, more than once, glancing at the door and then catching herself. On the 27th of December, she went to the Calhoun Ranch. She had a reason, a perfectly legitimate one. She needed to speak with Tom Calhoun about whether any of the ranch hand's children who were not currently enrolled in school might be persuaded to attend, and she had heard that Calhoun himself was a man who could be talked into good sense if approached the right way. She rode out on a borrowed horse from the livery, following the directions Ruth had given her, and arrived at the ranch in mid-morning to find it busy with the quiet work of a cattle operation in winter. Tom Calhoun was a weathered, direct man in his 50s who shook her hand without condescension, and listened to what she said and agreed to speak to his hands about the school, and seemed genuinely interested in the idea. He offered her coffee and she took it, and they talked for 20 minutes about the territory and the cattle market and the road conditions east, and it was a pleasant and productive visit. She was getting ready to leave when Clayton came in from the yard, stomping mud from his boots in the doorway, and stopped when he saw her. "Miss Turner," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said, and she felt the absurdity of their last name formality given everything they had told each other. But she did not know how to shift it with Tom Calhoun standing right there. Calhoun looked between them with the sharp eyes of a man who had spent his life reading livestock and people, and could tell when something was going on even when it was not saying anything. He made a polite excuse about checking on the horses and left them alone in the kitchen, which was so obvious a move that Maggie felt her face warm slightly. Clayton poured himself coffee and stood at the counter, and there was a different quality to the silence between them here than there was on the street in town, something more enclosed and more revealing. "You came out to the ranch," he said. "I had business with Mr. Calhoun, and now that business is done." "Yes." She buttoned her coat slowly. "I also wanted to tell you in person rather than in the street that the book was a perfect gift. Thank you." He looked at the bottom of his coffee cup. "You said your father was a teacher. I thought books." "You thought correctly." She looked at him. "Clayton." He looked up. "Why do you never smile?" The question surprised him. She could see that. It surprised her a little too, coming out more directly than she had planned, but she had meant to ask it for weeks, and it seemed that standing in Tom Calhoun's kitchen on a cold December morning was as good a time as any. He was quiet for so long that she thought he was simply not going to answer. He set down his cup. He looked at her in the careful, steady way he had, and she held that gaze and waited. "I was saving it," he said, and then, for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, a smile crossed Clayton Granger's face. It was not a small smile or a polite smile or the reflexive social smile that people paste on to get through the world. It was a full and genuine smile, slow and warm, the kind that starts at the eyes before it reaches the mouth, the kind that a person stores up over a long time and then spends all at once, and it transformed his face entirely, not into something different but into something completed, like a sentence that had been missing its final word. Maggie Turner stood very still and felt the world shift several degrees in a direction she had not anticipated but found she very much welcomed. "That," she said, when she had recovered herself sufficiently, "was worth waiting for." His smile faded to something quieter but did not disappear entirely, a remnant of it living around the corners of his eyes. "I was not sure you would think so," he said. "Why not?" "Because I am not a great deal of fun by most accounts." "I do not want a great deal of fun," she said carefully. "I want something real." He looked at her, and the something careful and curious she had seen before in his expression had given way to something she could only call open, and it was remarkable on his face. "Miss Turner," he said, "Maggie, I would like to ask your permission to call on you properly." "You have been calling on me improperly for 2 months," she said, and the smile came back to his face immediately, and this time he did not seem to be saving it for anything. "Then I would like to do it properly," he said. "Yes," she said simply, "I would like that." Tom Calhoun came back from the horses approximately 20 minutes after any reasonable horse check should have been completed, and found them both sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, talking, and the quality of the air in the room was different from when he had left it, lighter somehow, like a window had been opened. He pretended not to notice, which was the kindest thing he could have done. January in the territory was cold enough to keep people close to their fires and honest about their feelings, and Clayton Granger came to call on Maggie Turner every Sunday after church and on Wednesday evenings, and she looked forward to these visits with the clear-eyed acknowledgement of someone who has decided to stop pretending they do not feel what they feel. He sat in her small parlor and drank the coffee she made, which she had practiced making better because she had noticed his expression the first time she had served it, a slight flicker that told her it was not quite right, and over the weeks it improved. He brought things sometimes, not extravagant things but thoughtful ones, a jar of good honey from the Henley store, a piece of turquoise he had found on the ridge that was the exact dark blue-green of a deep pool, twice more a book, both of which she read immediately and both of which gave them an hour of conversation she would not have traded for anything. He talked more easily now, with her, in her small house with the fireplace going and the wind outside. He told her about cattle and horses with the same unsentimental love she had heard farmers use about their land, a love that was really about understanding, about knowing a thing so well you could read it in all its moods. He told her about a particularly fine quarter horse named Abner that he had been working with for a year, a difficult animal that most of the other hands had given up on, but that Clayton had stayed with until the horse decided to trust him. "How do you make a horse trust you?" she asked. "You do not make it do anything," he said. "You show up. You are consistent. You do not push when it is not ready. You let it come to you." She looked at him over her coffee cup. "I suspect you were not only talking about horses." His expression was serious, but his eyes were warm. "I suspect you are right," he said. She was falling in love with him. She knew it the way you know the change of a season, not by any single thing but by the accumulated evidence of everything, the way she thought of things throughout the day to tell him later, the way his absence on non-visit days felt like a word missing from a sentence, the way she could sit in silence with him for half an hour and feel more seen than she had in years of constant conversation with other people. And he was falling in love with her. She knew that too, though he expressed it in the ways particular to his nature, in consistency, and in showing up and in a quality of attention that was the most precious thing she had ever been given, the sense that, when Clayton Granger looked at her, she was the only thing in the landscape worth looking at. In February, good news came about the Ray's families. Clayton's lawyer in Albuquerque had found an irregularity in the chain of title that Crick's lawyers had submitted, specifically a notarization that appeared to have been backdated, and was moving to challenge the land office decision. It would take time and it was not certain, but it was a crack in the wall that had seemed solid, and when Clayton came to tell Maggie, she grabbed both his hands without thinking and said, that is wonderful, Clayton." And he looked at her hands in his with an expression she had not seen on him before, something soft and entirely unguarded. He did not let go of her hands right away, and she did not pull them back. "I told you I do not like raising hopes I cannot keep," he said quietly. "I know, but this is real progress and you did that, on behalf of people who do not have the tools to fight for themselves. That matters. You would have done the same." "I would have tried," she said. "You succeeded." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the firelight was doing what firelight does in the small hours of an evening, making everything feel closer and warmer and more honest, and she thought he was going to say something. But instead he looked down at their joined hands and then slowly, carefully, lifted one of her hands and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old and deliberate that it felt like a promise. She felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle in her chest and stay there. "Maggie," he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it as an answer to whatever he was about to say. He looked up at her. "I think you know what I am trying to say." "Say it anyway," she told him softly. "Some things need to be said." His jaw moved. He was working up to something and she could see the effort of it because words of this kind did not come easily to him, not the important ones, and she knew that. "I have been alone for a long time," he said, "and I had made a kind of peace with it, not happy exactly, but settled. And then you rode into this town with your wagon in pieces and your head held up like you were not going to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you rattled, and I thought, there is a woman who is going to be trouble." Despite herself, she laughed. "Trouble." "Good trouble," he said, and his expression was everything, serious and warm, and that remnant of the smile she had first seen in Calhoun's kitchen still living at the edges. The kind that makes you reconsider things. The kind that makes a year-old plan about a parcel of land on the other side of Coyote Ridge start to look different. Her heart was beating faster than she strictly wanted to acknowledge. Different how? She asked, though she knew. Like it has a reason, he said. The fire crackled. The wind pressed at the window. In the room that had been just hers for these months, something new was taking up space, and it was not frightening, it was the opposite of frightening. Clayton Granger, she said carefully, I believe you are telling me you love me. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, I am. She reached up and touched his face with one hand, and he turned his cheek slightly into her palm like an animal seeking warmth, and she said, I love you too, and meant every syllable of it the way she had never meant those words in her life. He kissed her then, gentle and certain, the way he did everything. And it was the kind of kiss that has gravity to it, that pulls everything in your life into a new arrangement. And she held onto his coat and felt entirely, completely, and unmistakably home. Spring came to the territory in the way that always felt like a revelation, even when you knew it was coming. The grass going green along the creek banks, and the sky opening into that particular deep blue that existed nowhere else in the world. And Dusty Creek breathed out after the winter and stretched into the warmth. The news about the Ray's family's land case had continued to develop, and by March it was clear that Crick's claim was going to be successfully challenged. The Territorial Land Office, faced with evidence of a fraudulent notarization that Clayton's lawyer had dug up thoroughly and presented meticulously, had suspended Crick's water rights pending a full investigation, and the Ray's families had been notified that their original rights would be restored. It was not entirely over yet. The legal machinery ground slowly, but the outcome was as certain as anything in the law could be. When the final word came in April, delivered by post from Albuquerque, Maggie read the letter at the breakfast table and cried, which surprised her, and then went directly to the school and told Lucia and Tomás Rays that their families would keep their land and their water. And Lucia burst into tears, and Tomás, who was 11 and considered himself too old for that sort of thing, turned very quickly to look out the window for a solid 2 minutes. She told Clayton that evening, and he received the news with the quiet satisfaction of a man who does not celebrate loudly but feels things deeply, and she held his face in her hands and said, "You did this." And he shook his head, but she held firm. "You did this," she repeated, "and I am so proud of you." He closed his eyes briefly at that, and she understood that no one had said those words to him in a very long time, possibly ever in the way she meant them, and she made a private promise to herself to say them as often as she could from here on. In late April, Clayton took her to see the land on the far side of Coyote Ridge. They rode out early in the morning, before the heat of the day, on horses borrowed from the Calhoun stable, and the land opened up around them as they climbed through the ridge country, the scrub cedar and juniper giving way to open grassland that rolled in gentle waves toward a line of cottonwoods that marked the stream. Clayton rode slightly ahead, navigating from memory, and she followed his lead and watched the land through his eyes, trying to see what he saw. They came over a low rise, and the full view opened, and she understood immediately why he had been thinking about this land for a year. It was generous country, wide and well-watered, with the mountains at its back and a slight southward tilt that would catch the sun through the growing season, and the stream that ran along its eastern edge was strong and clear. "This is it," he said. She looked at it for a long time. The potential of it was unmistakable, the space for a house, a barn, a kitchen garden, all of it there in the land's own natural suggestion. "It is beautiful," she said. He was watching her. "You are the reason I can see it right now," he said. "I used to come here and see work, just land that needed working. Now I see it differently." She turned her horse to face him. The morning light was on his face, and he was not saving anything. He had stopped saving things some time in February, and the openness of his expression was still something she found remarkable, the gift of it from a man who had kept everything so long behind such careful walls. "Then we should build something on it," she said. He held very still. "You would leave your house in town." I would not leave my school, she said clearly. But a house 8 miles from town is not impossible, and a good horse makes it manageable. And yes, she looked at the land and back at him. I would leave the town house. Maggie, he said, was that too presumptuous, she asked. Because I am very good at walking things back if I have misread the situation. You have not misread anything, he said, and his voice was rough at the edges with something he was working to contain. He reached into his coat pocket and produced something she had not expected, a ring, plain gold with a small turquoise stone, the dark blue-green of the piece he had brought her in January. I had this made in February, he said. In Albuquerque, through the same lawyer. I asked him to find a jeweler. He paused. I have been carrying it for 2 months. She looked at the ring and looked at him and felt her eyes fill, which she willed not to happen and which happened anyway. You have been carrying it for 2 months, she repeated. I was trying to find the right moment, he said, though I am not sure I know what that means. This moment, she said, right now, on this land, is perfect. He held the ring out and she gave him her hand, and he put it on her finger with the same careful precision he gave everything, and it fit, which she thought she might cry properly about later. He kept hold of her hand. Marry me, he said, and it was both a question and a statement, the way he said things when he was most sure of them. Yes, she said, for the second time in her life answering that question, and this time there was nothing in her that doubted or equivocated or held back. Yes, absolutely yes. He pulled her toward him on horseback in the impractical way of the very determined and kissed her with the full force of everything he had been carrying for months, and she kissed him back with everything she had, and the territory spread out around them bright and wide and full of every possible future. They were married in June. The wedding was held at the church, which was filled to its modest capacity with the whole of Dusty Creek and a number of people who had ridden in from outlying ranches, because in a small town a wedding is everyone's business and no one minds. Ruth Henley cried from the first hymn. Tom Calhoun sat in the second row and looked pleased with himself in the way of men who like to take some small credit for good outcomes. Dr. Hale gave a reading that was either very wise or very beautiful, and in this case it managed to be both. Lucia Ray's mother, Maria, brought flowers from the creekbank garden that she would not have been able to keep if not for Clayton's quiet campaign on her family's behalf. Yellow and white wildflowers in a bunch tied with ribbon, and she pressed them into Maggie's hands before the service with tears in her eyes, and a great deal of Spanish that Maggie understood only imperfectly, but understood entirely. Maggie wore her best dress, a deep green that she had brought from Santa Fe and saved for a significant occasion, correctly anticipating that an occasion of sufficient significance would eventually arrive. She had let Ruth put her hair up in a way that felt like herself rather than something imposed, and she carried Maria's wildflowers, and she walked down the aisle with her head up in the way she always had and met Clayton at the front of the church. He was wearing a new suit, the first new suit he had owned in years, and he had made some peace with it. He stood at the altar with the straight-back stillness that was natural to him, and when she came down the aisle, he watched her with the full and undivided attention he had given her from the beginning, the kind that made you feel like the only thing in the landscape, and he was smiling. He was smiling freely and openly and without reservation, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, and she almost stopped walking to say so but kept going instead, because you cannot stop in the middle of a wedding aisle even when you want to. And she reached his side and took his hand, and they turned together to face the Reverend. The Reverend, perhaps mindful of Clayton's earlier critique, kept his words simple. They said their vows in front of everyone, clearly and without stumbling, looking at each other, and the church was so quiet you could hear the wind outside and the creak of the old building. And then the Reverend said the words that made them husband and wife, and the church erupted in the uncomplicated joy of people who are genuinely glad. Clayton kissed her and someone in the back row whooped, and several people laughed, and Ruth Henley wept in earnest, and Tommy Hendricks, seated beside his mother, said loudly, "Why is Mrs. Henley crying?" And his mother hushed him, and it was exactly right, all of it, every imperfect and perfect moment of it. They built the house on the land beyond Coyote Ridge through the summer, Clayton directing the construction with the same patient and methodical approach he brought to everything, hiring from the town where he could, and doing much of the framing himself with Tom Calhoun's hands helping on the heavy days. It was not a large house, but it was a well-made one, 2 stories with a wide front porch that faced south and caught the afternoon sun, and a kitchen with a proper stove that Maggie spent a happy afternoon choosing from the catalog at Henley's store. She continued teaching. She rode into Dusty Creek 6 mornings a week, the 8 miles feeling like nothing after the first few weeks, and she was back in the afternoons in time for the evening. It was not a small thing to ride that distance twice a day, and people occasionally expressed concern, and she thanked them and kept doing it because the school was hers in a way that went beyond employment, and she was not going to give it up for anything. Clayton never suggested she should. He understood the school the way he understood the land and the horses, as something essential to the person it belonged to, and you did not interfere with essential things. In the first autumn of their marriage, when the aspen on the ridge had gone gold and the mornings had their bite again, and the house was settled into itself enough to feel like home rather than construction, Maggie found out she was going to have a child. She told Clayton in the kitchen on a Saturday morning when the light was coming in long and golden through the south-facing windows, and she watched his face as he understood what she was telling him, and it went through several things in rapid succession: surprise, and then something profound and quiet, something that had no single name but that she recognized as the same thing she had felt when he had looked at her on the ridge with the ring in his hand. The feeling of something becoming real that you had not quite let yourself believe in. He stood up from his chair and came to her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she waited. "A child," he said finally. "Yes," she said, "our child." "That is generally how it works," she said, and the smile came to his face at once and he laughed, a real laugh that she did not hear often enough and treasured accordingly. He pulled her into his arms and held her with the careful strength that was characteristic of everything he did, firmly and without breaking, and she pressed her face into his shoulder and thought about her father and his voice reading to her from whatever he had to hand, and thought about a woman she had never met who had taught her son to read from Ken labels, and felt the continuity of love across time like a thread pulled taut. The baby came in spring, a boy born with an enormous amount of dark hair, and a disposition that announced itself as entirely his own from approximately the first hour of his life. They named him James after Maggie's father, and the middle name was Thomas, after Tom Calhoun, who had absolutely not been expecting that honor and who, when told, cleared his throat several times and looked at the ceiling and then shook Clayton's hand so hard it lasted nearly a full minute. James Granger was a loud and determined infant who became a loud and determined toddler, and Clayton took to fatherhood with the same thorough investment he brought to everything he cared about, which was to say completely and without reservation. He could quiet the baby in the middle of the night when no one else could, walking the narrow hallway of the house with James against his shoulder, his voice a low, steady sound that Maggie, lying in bed, could hear through the wall and that always settled her own heartbeat before James's. Lucia Reyes continued in school, and at 15 was the top student Maggie had ever taught, with a particular gift for mathematics that made Maggie write urgent letters to the Territorial Department of Education about opportunities for students like Lucia, and then more urgent letters when those letters were not answered, and then letters to the Albuquerque newspaper, which were answered, and which resulted in a small notice about educational inequality in the territory that was read by enough people to produce results. Lucia Reyes, at 17, received an offer of a funded place at a school in Santa Fe that trained teachers, and Maggie stood in the schoolroom after the other children had gone and told her. And Lucia, who was not a girl who cried easily, stood very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was very careful and very controlled, "Will you write to me, Mrs. Granger?" And Maggie said, "Every week without fail." And then they did both cry, and it was entirely appropriate. The second year of their marriage was quieter in some ways and richer in others. The way second years tend to be when the first year has already settled the large questions, and what remains is the daily and continuous choice to love someone, which is a larger thing than the initial decision, and also a better one. Clayton bought the full parcel of land beyond Coyote Ridge in the autumn of the second year, having worked and saved with the patience of someone who had been working and saving his whole life, and was now doing it with a purpose that clarified everything. He left the cowhound operation with Tom's blessing and a handshake that went on as long as the one over the baby's name, and began the slower, more independent work of building his own cattle operation from modest but solid foundations. He was good at it in the way she had known he would be, thorough and practical and patient, with an instinct for animals and for the rhythms of the land that came from years of careful attention. He hired 2 hands, brothers named Eli and Peter Marsh, Clara Marsh's nephews, who were reliable and hardworking, and who regarded Clayton with the particular respect of young men for someone who teaches them something true. James, at 2, could say horse clearly and said it constantly, pointing at every equine within range, and Clayton began taking him out to see Abner in the mornings, the difficult quarter horse who had long since become Clayton's most trusted animal, and James would sit on the fence rail with Clayton's hand steadying him and watch the horse with enormous and solemn attention and say, with great authority, "Horse," and Clayton would say, "Yes, that is a horse. That is Abner specifically," and James would consider this additional information and file it away. Maggie watched these mornings from the kitchen window sometimes, the man and the small boy at the fence, and felt a fullness in her chest that she had no adequate words for and did not particularly need any. The school had grown by its second year under her tenure to 18 students, the largest enrollment it had ever had, and she had successfully lobbied Mayor Potts for a second teacher to take the younger children while she focused on the older ones. The teacher who arrived was a young woman from Albuquerque named Frances Dodds, who was 22 and earnest and a little overwhelmed by Dusty Creek at first, and Maggie took her under her care the way good teachers do, firmly and warmly, and by Christmas Frances had found her footing and was flourishing. The winter of the second year brought a hard freeze that tested the new cattle operation and required 3 consecutive days of work in brutal cold to save the herd from the worst of it. And Clayton came inside on the third night hollow-eyed with exhaustion and cold to the bone, and Maggie got him out of his frozen coat and sat him by the fire and brought him hot food and sat beside him and did not say anything that needed saying because nothing needed to be said. He ate and the warmth came back into him by degrees, and after a time he leaned his head back and looked at her and said, "I do not know what I did before you." And she put her head on his shoulder and said, "Something considerably colder," and he laughed that good real laugh, and the house held them both. By the third year of their marriage, Dusty Creek itself had grown. A new general merchandise store had opened, the church had been expanded, and there was talk of a proper hotel. The territory was changing, slowly and not always gracefully, but changing, and the sense of impermanence that had characterized it in its wilder years was giving way to something more settled, more permanent, more like a place that intended to stay. The legal case regarding the Rays families had been fully resolved the previous year, Crick's claim entirely dismissed by the land office following the investigation into the fraudulent notarization, which had resulted in considerable professional difficulty for the lawyers involved, and the complete restoration of the Rays family's water and land rights. Wallace Crick had left the territory in the summer, no one in Dusty Creek troubling themselves much about where he had gone. Maria Rays had come to the Granger house that summer with a dish of tamales, and had sat with Maggie in the kitchen for 2 hours talking about the land and the future and her daughter in Santa Fe. And before she left, she had taken Maggie's hands and spoken at length, and Maggie, whose Spanish had improved considerably over 3 years, understood most of it, which was essentially that some debts could never be repaid, and that the Reyes family knew what had been done for them, and that it would not be forgotten. Maggie told Clayton this, and he looked uncomfortable in the way he always did when gratitude came at him directly, and said that anyone would have done it, and Maggie said firmly, "No, they would not have. You did." And he looked at her for a moment and then nodded once, accepting it. In the spring of the 3rd year, Maggie was expecting their 2nd child. This pregnancy was different from the first in that she was more tired at the beginning, but then found her footing faster, having some experience of the thing now, and she kept teaching until late June before allowing Frances to cover more of the load, and then went back 6 weeks after the baby came, which everyone in town agreed was too soon, but which she did anyway. The 2nd baby was a girl. They named her Elena Rose, Elena for no particular reason except that it suited her at first sight, and Rose for the small rose cutting from Maggie's Santa Fe house that she had brought with her on the wagon and planted in the kitchen garden, and which had bloomed every summer since. Elena Rose Granger came into the world as though she had an appointment to keep and did not intend to be late, and she was quieter than her brother in temperament but not in opinion, and she expressed that opinion from very early on in a series of very pointed looks that Clayton said reminded him, entirely without apology, of her mother. "I take that as a compliment," Maggie said. "It was intended as one," he said. James received his sister with the grave and proprietorial concern of a 3-year-old, which was to say that he regarded her with some suspicion for approximately 2 weeks, and then decided she was acceptable, and subsequently appointed himself her protector with a dedication that was both touching and occasionally excessive. The house, which had seemed the right size when they built it, revealed itself to be entirely adequate for a family of 4, with the 2 upstairs rooms that had seemed like a luxury now proving themselves necessities. Clayton built a proper crib for Elena, as he had built one for James, because he had a gift for woodwork that was connected to the same spatial and patient intelligence that made him good with horses and land and broken wagon wheels, and the crib was solid and smooth and beautiful in a practical way that said everything about the man who had made it. In the autumn of the 3rd year, they received a letter from Lucia Reyes, who was now a qualified teacher and had been offered a position in a school in Taos and had taken it, and who wrote to Maggie with the kind of formality and warmth that exists between teachers and their best students, a particular kind of love that is about legacy and continuation. She said that she taught the way Mrs. Granger had taught her, which was to teach children not only what to think but how to think, and that she thought of her often. Maggie read the letter at the kitchen table, and Clayton watched her face as she read it, and when she looked up her eyes were bright, and she said, "She is going to do remarkable things," and he said, "So are we," and she reached across the table and took his hand. The 4th year of their marriage was the year that Dusty Creek got its hotel and its first newspaper, a small weekly called the Creek Gazette, and its 2nd doctor, a young woman from back east named Dr. Alice Pryor, who arrived with her medical bag and her credentials, and was met with suspicion from some quarters and open relief from others, Maggie being firmly in the latter. Dr. Pryor settled in quickly and proved herself competent and committed, and became, in time, another of Maggie's friends, the circle of women in Dusty Creek who had found each other and who held each other up in the way women have always done. The Granger cattle operation had expanded modestly by the 4th year, enough to employ 3 hands now, and to have established a reputation for good stock that brought buyers from as far as Albuquerque. Clayton had the same steady approach to business that he had to everything, not greedy, not reckless, building carefully and keeping his word in every dealing, which in those years and in that part of the world was the most powerful reputation a man could have. He had also, in the fourth year, done the thing he had never quite done before, which was to let himself be known in the town. He was never loud, never social in the way of men who need a crowd around them, but he had stopped being absent. He was at community meetings when they mattered. He was at church not just as a duty, but as a member of something. He organized, quietly and with no fanfare, a collection for a family who lost their house to fire in November, going from door to door himself with his hat in his hands, and the amount raised was enough to rebuild. He was, Maggie thought, watching him from across a room at one of Ruth's suppers, the kind of man that a community does not know it needs until it has him. The kind that holds things together not by being conspicuous but by being reliable, always there, always consistent, always doing the right thing at the right time without asking for credit. She caught his eye from across the room, and he looked at her in the particular way he had, the way that said 1,000 things in the vocabulary they had built together. And she smiled at him, and he smiled back, that full and genuine smile that she had been the first to earn, and that still, after 4 years, had the same effect on her that it had had in Tom Calhoun's kitchen on a cold December morning. James was 4 and Alina was 1 when the territory had its particularly brutal summer of 1887, the heat settling in like something with malicious intent, and the water in the lesser creeks dropping to worrying levels. The Granger stream held, being fed by a mountain source that proved reliable, but others were not so fortunate, and Clayton, with the matter-of-fact generosity that was simply his nature, extended water rights to 2 neighboring families whose supply had dried up, without negotiation and without condition. One of those families was the Hendricks family, Tommy Hendricks's people, and Tommy, now 9 and as earnest as ever, came with his father to help with the watering of their cattle from the Granger stream, and he and James, who at 4 had become a person of considerable energy and opinion, spent several afternoon hours causing a great deal of harmless trouble around the barn while their fathers worked, and Maggie, watching from the porch, thought about the ways that generosity creates connections that last and ripple outward. That summer Dr. Pryor treated a serious outbreak of dysentery in town with impressive competence and managed to contain it without fatalities, which under other management might not have been the outcome. And Maggie organized a collection from the school families to ensure the doctor had the medical supplies she needed for the following year, because she had learned from Clayton that the most useful thing you could do was solve a problem before it became a crisis. Autumn came and broke the heat, and the territory breathed out. The harvest that year was modest but sufficient, and the community meeting in October had a quality of relief to it that everyone felt without necessarily naming. By the 5th year of their marriage, Maggie Turner Granger had been the teacher at Dusty Creek School for nearly 6 years, long enough to have seen her first students growing into young people who could think and read and argue and question and contribute, which was all she had ever wanted to give them. She had 3 students from her first year who were now helping the younger ones during recesses, which was the surest sign she knew of that something had taken hold. That education was becoming not just a thing done to the children of Dusty Creek, but a thing they owned. She had also in the 5th year begun writing for the Creek Gazette, a column on education that then expanded into a column on community issues more broadly, which was read and argued about with the enthusiastic engagement that good writing always provokes, and which she was told by the editor, a slight, precise man named Alden Park, was the most read thing in the paper, which she found very pleasing. Clayton read every column she wrote with careful attention, and they discussed them over dinner, and his comments were always useful in the particular way of someone who thinks differently from you and whom you trust completely, which is the rarest and most valuable kind of feedback in the world. In the spring of the 5th year, Maggie wrote a column about the education of girls in the territory, specifically about the ways in which the formal and informal systems conspired to limit what was available to them past a certain age. and it provoked more letters to the editor than any previous column, and required 3 follow-up pieces, and eventually resulted in a meeting organized by Mayor Potts at which Maggie spoke for 40 minutes and was roundly applauded by most of the room and narrowly frowned at by a few, which was, she had come to understand, the appropriate ratio for ideas worth having. Clayton sat in the back of that meeting in his usual position at the edge of things, and when she looked at him in the middle of her speech, he gave her a single, small nod that said everything she needed to hear. Eleanor at 2 was a person of strong preferences and clear communication, who had opinions about her clothing and her meals and the sequence of events in her days, and who had, to everyone's great amusement, begun following her father around the property with the look of someone conducting a serious inspection. Clayton accommodated this with complete seriousness, explaining things to her, as he worked in the way he had learned to explain things without condescension, and Maggie sometimes came around a corner of the barn to find the two of them in close discussion about something at eye level to a 2-year-old, Clayton on his haunches, Eleanor with her small hands on her hips, and she would stop and watch them and feel the fullness in her chest that still had no adequate words and still did not need them. James at 5 had decided he wanted to be a horse, which was a phase he moved through with complete commitment for about 6 weeks before transitioning to wanting to be a mathematician, which had been suggested by something Miss Dodds had said in school and which Maggie received with great satisfaction. By the time their 6th year together settled into its autumn rhythms, the Granger ranch was a real operation, not large by some measures but solid and reputable, and the house beyond Coyote Ridge had become the kind of home that you feel the moment you step onto the porch, the kind where the wood remembers the living done inside it and gives it back to you as warmth. Maggie taught and wrote and argued for things worth arguing for, and raised 2 children who would grow into people of substance, because they came from people of substance, and rode her horse 8 miles in the morning and 8 miles back in the evening 6 days a week, with the uncomplaining consistency of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and why. Clayton worked his land and his animals and his community with the same quiet thoroughness that had always been his nature, and he smiled now, frequently and genuinely and without reservation, most often when he was looking at his wife across a room or at his children in the yard, or at something in the land around him that reminded him of all the ways in which the world was, when you looked at it correctly, full of reasons too. He had never become a man who talked a great deal or who wanted to be the center of any room, but he had become a man who was entirely present in the rooms he was in, which is a different and better thing, and the people of Dusty Creek understood him the way communities come to understand the people who are genuinely part of them, not perfectly but truly. One evening in the 6th October of their marriage, when the children were asleep and the fire was down to embers and the autumn wind was doing its long, low work outside, Maggie sat beside Clayton on the porch wrapped in a blanket, both of them looking at the sky which in those years before the light of cities was as full of stars as anything you will ever see, and she said, "Do you remember what you said to me when I asked you why you never smiled?" He turned to look at her. The lamplight from the window was just enough to see his face by. "I said I was saving it," he said. "Yes," she said, "and then you smiled." "Yes," he said, "I have been thinking about that," she said. "About what it meant. Not what you meant when you said it, though I have thought about that too, but what it means now looking back." He waited in the way he always waited, with full attention. "I think you had decided that nothing was worth spending it on," she said. "Not as a sad thing, just as a fact. Like money you save because there is nothing worth buying." And then she paused. Then something was. He was quiet for a long moment, and the stars and the wind filled the silence between them with the good fullness of things that do not need to be hurried. "Yes," he said finally, "that is it exactly." She leaned her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the blanket covered them both, And somewhere inside the house James turned over in his sleep with the particular thump of a 5-year-old who has no concerns about waking anyone, and Alina made a small sound that resolved into silence. "Are you happy?" She asked him because she asked him this sometimes, not because she doubted it but because she liked to hear his answer, which was always particular to him and therefore always worth having. He was quiet in the way that meant he was actually thinking about it, not just answering. "Yes," he said, "more than I knew was possible, more than I knew how to want." He paused. "Are you?" "Endlessly," she said, and meant it with every part of herself, with the part that had ridden into Dusty Creek with a cracked wheel and her head up and her heart open to whatever came next, and with all the parts that had grown since, the parts that were his and the children's and this land's and this sky's. The stars went on overhead in their endless cold and brilliant certainty, and the house behind them held its sleeping children, and the land stretched out in every direction toward a future that was theirs to make. Clayton Granger, who had once saved his smiles for something worth spending them on, was smiling now, quietly and without any particular occasion, because the occasion was every moment of this life, and he had learned, with the help of a woman who noticed things and did not let silence win, that the best investments are the ones you make for keeps. He held her closer and she held on, and the night went on around them, and there was nothing left unresolved, nothing left unfinished, nothing left to save. Only the living of it, warm and full and entirely, completely theirs.